Right. So the topic at hand, service-oriented architecture. So last year I became interested in service-oriented architecture. I was on a sales call with, we'll change names to protect the innocent. I was on a sales call with someone and was talking with this prospective client, and they were talking about some of their needs, and I said, you know, sales calls, time to use buzzwords. I'm like, well, it sounds like you might need SOA. And they agreed, and I'm like, oh crap, I have no idea what I just said. And so over about the next month or so, I started researching what I had offered. I was hoping that there might be someone, I work at an agency, and I was hoping there might be someone that might know anything about it. Instead, maybe a couple weeks later, I'm standing at a whiteboard drawing, and I call over one of our senior developers. I'm like, hey, Aaron, does this look like SOA to you? I don't even know what this is anymore. And so we're standing there scratching our heads. Anyway, after a lot of research, after a lot of information gathering, and writing a lot of code, we've come up with what we might call SOA. So let's first kind of talk about what SOA is. But first let's kind of talk about what the viewpoints around SOA are, what the goals for service-oriented architecture is. So these are kind of the promises of what SOA might offer. We want to find a transparency in our code and what the system does. You know, we want to fit the customer, that it's adaptable, that it's multi-channel, you know, for web, etc. That it's a one-stop experience for the entire enterprise. So that's kind of the viewpoint. Microsoft really started pushing service-oriented architecture back in 2004. And they clarified 4 tenets around service-oriented architecture. So these might be the rules of service-oriented architecture. They say that services must be autonomous. So one service cannot depend on another service. So let's talk briefly about what two services might look like. You might have a catalog. In an e-commerce system, you might have a catalog service, and you might have a finance service. So the finance service might be responsible for creating a purchase order, and the catalog would be responsible for telling you what they have to sell. So those two things should be autonomous, right? That each service only, of course, shares contract and schema. So, for example, you know, we're very familiar with code against interface rather than implementation. That's essentially what that's saying. The compatibility is based on policy. We'll get into that a little bit later, but essentially, you know, there's some rules that say, okay, this is how we work together. And the boundaries are incredibly explicit. So a lot of times when you start getting down into, we'll talk about this a little later, domain modeling, it becomes unclear as to which service might own it. And so we want to be very explicit about this. Now, I'm sure Bill was very confused after those tenets came out, because I was too, and I think most developers were. So since Bill hasn't written code since 1992, I'm sure he's like, what the hell did those guys just say? So, Microsoft came out with WCF, the golden hammer. They said, oh, this is service-oriented architecture. There you are. I'm sorry we even mentioned it, guys. We'll just give you a technology, and you can point and click and make WCF services. So this is our traditional layered or stacked architecture, where we have the persistence layer, we have an access layer. To that persistence, we have a business layer, we have a UI. It looks very similar, very familiar to a lot of our architecture. So good. So now I have this service layer that I could just wedge right in between there, and that doesn't make any sense, right? That just means another layer that I have to maintain now. Doesn't really bring any of those tenants to the table. So why the hell would I put a service in between there and just have one more layer? And WCF, if you haven't ever used it, can be a little argumentative occasionally. So I don't want that in there if that's what it's going to look like. So I'm still confused. So is Bill. So we're going to kind of walk through each of these tenets, and we're going to offer some additional technologies that might help, patterns and practices technologies, that might help us achieve some of these tenets. Okay, so WCF isn't going to cut it. Let's go back here, though. What WCF does offer us is it offers us compatibility based upon policy. It also offers us this. But it really doesn't offer us an explicit boundary, and it doesn't ensure that our services are autonomous, right? Because if we go back to this diagram here, and Bill, get out of the way. If we go back to this diagram, there's this service layer. There's no autonomy there. It's all been piled into one layer, right? So if we look at the domain modeling, and that's what I started to allude to before, we could start to make some autonomy or maybe some explicit boundaries, or we could at least start creating some boundaries in between the software. So domain modeling suggests that you look at the actual business, and if we go back to those original viewpoints, we're looking at customer fit. If you go to the actual business and look at the business unit that is responsible for a specific task or a specific function, and try to align the software into those domains, you could start to create explicit boundaries, right? Because within that business unit, within finance business unit, within warehouse business unit, they have particular roles and responsibilities. If we make the software fit that, the value proposition is that when someone in the warehouse says, I need this new feature, it might not impact the finance domain. So, now let's go back to our stacked diagram. So now we're going to say, across each layer, we're going to create different domains. A sales domain, a finance, a logistics domain. And within each layer, we'll start to create some explicit boundaries, right? The challenge is that even though they're explicit, there may not be autonomy. And the reason is because it's very easy for me to still start to sneak some business logic into one side or the other, and particularly in those gray areas or those handshake areas. So let's go back to that e-commerce example. Who gets to manage the cart? And when does the catalog become a cart? And when does the cart become an order? Right? And so the challenge is that we start to see the development team being unclear about that and start dropping in methods into the wrong domain. Okay. So the next approach is that we can take WCF, layer on domain model pattern, and then layer on an enterprise service bus. And so the ESB, there's no good way to depict an ESB, so you just put a lightning bolt. The ESB would then turn this more into a messaging type system. So one approach is to say, okay, in the sales domain may be responsible for the cart, right? And the cart, once the cart is complete, it may broadcast a message across the bus over to finance saying, please go ahead and charge this customer or create a purchase order for this customer. Because you're starting to get the developers into thinking about message communication rather than actual method calls, it becomes much more clear to the team about these are all services. These are all services that I should be able to call on the bus, and all the communication is happening on the bus. If there's any statefulness to happen, it has to happen it has to happen within that message, or you have to push it down to the persistence layer, but then really you're looking at even separation in the persistence layer. And that's where the challenge really starts to play in SOA, is in the persistence layer. There's a lot of temptation to start playing around in that. So even this is not the whiz-bang solution. Then we start looking, and Andrew, my colleague, is going to start showing you a little bit about command query separation as well. So we've got some code to show you that will demonstrate this particular scenario with some CQS. So that model might satisfy these four tenets. I do find it entertaining that WCF was presented as the end-all, be-all solution. Now the other challenge is the UI. As you saw, the domain modeling also, was proposed that the domain modeling would go all the way up to the UI. Amazon is a great example of domain modeling on the UI. This could be their Kindle sales domain. This is their sales domain here. This is their customer care domain. So you can actually break the UI itself into various domains as well. We haven't ever gotten there before. And so that's about all I have to say about that. So, I'm going to wrap this up and talk and get into some code here. I do just want to kind of chat a little bit about. It's not an all-in-all package. There's no need to pick all three of these and pile it into every single project. 1, 2, 3 might be enough. One of those three, maybe two of them. But in most of the cases, so it's just not important. Right. There are some cases where WCF is important because you need to have communication via policy, right? There's some times where if you have such disparate businesses or business units, it's important to have autonomy. If you have a large enterprise system, you could start looking at SOA. CQS and ESBs are nice for high throughput systems. But really, SOA has been really overhyped. And a lot of times it just doesn't make sense to implement it. So really consider carefully before you start going into it. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this over to Andrew. He's so we started writing some code last February that might be SOA. And Andrew, I've jumped off that project in more recent months, and so Andrew is taking point on that. So I thought he would be the right guy to get in front of you and let you kind of let him share with you our experiences. Bear with me for just a second while we open this project or solution. While we're doing that, does anyone who here has implemented a SOA system?
I overheard you earlier.
Personally implemented, but where we do, our setup is we have several websites that we offload billing to, or users logging in, stuff like that, maintaining single user access to specific websites. All that stuff is kind of offloaded. So we have a few websites that all connect with these services to fetch content for our site. We kind of serve up articles and book content and stuff like that. Again, that's all kind of pushed off to the server. So each of the websites, although different in some respects, can consume the service, but then apply additional business specific for their website.
Okay.
Logging on top of that. So billing.
And bear in mind, this is the solution that I've got set up here was pretty much based on the client at hand. So this kind of system can be implemented in many, many different ways. I just designed this because this is how their processes work. And by no means, this is no solution. This solution would not fit in every single aspect. So just the way I did this, it's just the way I did it for this one client.
Any discussion or questions while we're getting the solution open up? Yeah, jump in there, buddy.
Sorry, I wrote it down. If there's with separating things into domains, if one domain wants a feature that is similar or identical to another feature that they see in the domain, but it's set up there that you don't share classes or types, is there the risk of code repetition?
Well, what we do is we'll have a library that will have a lot of your services in your factories built into that library that is shared among everything. So it's just like a common library.
Okay.
And as long as those are kept private, that's fine. It's more when they start getting shared publicly. But you'd want to consider carefully what those services are. Also, there's the opportunity for common services, right? So there is definitely a performance a trade-off if you start getting into, if you wanted to do if you had a string concat or string formatting service, that might be kind of ridiculous to kick things off to. Okay, I think I've opened Visual Studio a couple times. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about autonomy, Ken? I don't know if I ever heard the definition of that in terms of the tooling.
Sure. My understanding of autonomy is that each service should work independently. Statefulness should be there really shouldn't be interdependent statefulness. And it really comes down to persistence. So if, for example, let's say we have the sales and the logistics domain, right? And the sales domain says, okay, Andrew would like one widget. It is not fair game for the logistics domain to go over to the sales domain persistence layer and find out its order. Instead, the sales domain should be providing that statefulness via either a message or arguments. It doesn't particularly fail that WCF in and of itself. The problem is most developers will fail in that, in myself included, because typically what I'll do is I'll say, well, I've got it right there. But if I'm forced to communicate via the bus every time, then I'm thinking more abstractly, more around the message situation.
And it also helps give you a better audit trail of what the system is actually doing. Because every time a message goes across that bus, it's recorded. And so you want to name these messages based on the process that's actually happened or happening.
Yeah, and so Andrew's talking about an opportunity in ESBs as well. And this isn't really one of the tenets of SOA, but what the opportunity is for us to become more semantic, right? So we can actually, rather than just running around with data, I can actually have a message that says, order complete, right? Rather than updating a record with a value. So then we actually have the intent along with that. You could even have more intent, and you could have polymorphic messages that would say, okay, order complete for business account, order complete for consumer account. And then you'll be able to go through this log and really understand the meaning behind the message. The other nice thing is of course, with ESBs, I know we talked about in-service bus last year, but with those messages, you can rehydrate your system.
Correct.
That was actually my next question. Would you suggest as a service bus, or as how would you transfer messages between? So
well,
probably you just answered the message.
Yeah, in this current project, we use in-service bus, okay. But there's a lot of different buses out there.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, what
right.
would you suggest, and what's your experience with different buses?
We've liked NSB, and we've reached out to what's his name, Yuri? Udi. We reached out to Udi for tech support actually, and he was very good about supporting the software for a fee, which is fair. And the nice thing as well about NSB is by default it runs on MSMQ. So for the low price of $500, you can get Microsoft on the phone when you have a problem with MSMQ.
Yeah.
So Andrew, I'm going to give you the keyboard.
All right.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments or experience to share? Good. Neither of us, I would say, are the experts.
Yeah, we're neither one.
We're both just sharing kind of what we've done over the past year. So.
Yeah, a lot of this solution here is based on stuff that I've actually learned in the past year. So, I mean, they brought me on board just to help with this project, and I love it. Okay, as what he was talking about earlier, we've got different services, and what I like to call bounded contexts. So we're keeping everything separate. We've got a place to take care of all the auctions, which does all the bidding and all that good stuff that deals with auctions. Got this catalog, and I'm going to go in detail a little bit in here. Within this catalog, we've got two different things here called commands and events. The way I like to think of things is a command is something that you're telling the system to do. An event is something that has happened within the system. And so let's say we've got this create product command. And you may see this class is a little bit different because I like to keep my classes pretty much independent, which means nothing outside of this class can change any property. So the way I create my classes is through the constructor.
Andrew, can you bump that copy of the font size up a little bit?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, that should have worked.
Not sure I'll do without other than
Or is that too much?
a little less.
Here.
Mine is
I tried that. It didn't work.
If you just click in there and do 150, I think that'll be perfect.
All right. What's that full screen?
Just double click the tab.
Yeah.
Or that. I'm taking it. I'm just gonna hold now.
That GUID comb generator, it just pretty much generates a GUID, but it's based on the time of the machine, so that when you generate GUIDs, they go in sequence, so that it's a lot quicker lookups and stuff like that. It's really neat, and that's actually built into the in-service bus that I just use. And so as you can see, that's all it pretty much does. And an event is actually pretty similar, other than as you see right there, I did not pull in the product ID, but within the event, that's actually there. There we go. Yeah, that's not working.
It's okay.
I have no idea what you guys are trying. I have no idea what you guys are trying to do. So I don't.
Expand the font. Blow it up.
Don't
Zoom.
control mouse. Do you have a mouse there?
No, no mouse.
I have a mouse.
In tools options, just right on font, just pump it up to like 60.
There we go.
Yes,
There we go. Okay, but as you see here, I'm actually sending in the product ID to the constructor because here the product has already been created. What we're doing here, and I'm going to show you how this actually comes into play here in a few minutes, is these events that come out of the system is we'll have the front end will actually sit and listen for these events, and that will actually what will populate its database. Because currently, these events right now actually get stored in the database in binary format based on this ID. You cannot actually do queries on any of these events. You only do a lookup by that ID. And I'll show you that right now in this handler. And I do use a lot of IOC. IOC is very important in this type of project, unless you just want to create that repository every single time. And as you can see down here, let me zoom this in a little bit. Pretty much, this product right here, and I'll get to that in a minute, that product class is actually what they call the aggregate base, or the aggregate root. And all I do is just call this create product, which actually creates an instance of the product, and then I save it in the repository. And as you see, this repository, we just save it and save it in the binary format in the database. And it knows how to do everything based off of the aggregate because as you see here, I inherit from this class. It's called an aggregate base. We use a separate product called Common Domain. It was written by Jonathan Oliver, and it actually takes care of a lot of the intricate behind-the-scenes work of controlling these aggregates, saving them to the event store, and then being able to repopulate them. This domain here, pretty much, as you can see, all these variables are private. Nothing can be accessed from the outside unless I explicitly allow somebody to get a reference to one of these things, especially for like the images and the catalog items. Right here you'll see that I've made this catalog items public so that when you create an instance of this product, there are multiple catalog items. Not to get into too much detail, but a catalog item just is a reference to a vendor, because multiple vendors could sell this product. And that's basically all that is. And as you see, we only reference by GUID. We do not actually reference the actual catalog item. That's very important because you do not want to put the full objects like you do in a lot of CRUD applications. You'll have your product, and then you'll have a list of all the catalog items brought in through your queries, so that you don't have to do 2 queries. But here, you don't want that. You want to actually just give the ID of the catalog item, and then you'll actually pull that catalog item in by its ID. And just to show you what's happening here, when this product is actually created, I call this thing called raise event, and it raises this event called product created. And so that's how that event actually gets pushed. When this raise event is called, and then I do that save on the command handler that you seen a few minutes ago, it will actually save this event and then publish this event to the server's bus, so that all of the denormalizers or the public-facing websites can listen to these events. I know this is a lot, so I'm just going to go through a couple of things, and then I'd like to ask y'all, see what kind of questions y'all have. When that raise event is called, we've got a lot of these private methods that says apply, and this is all part of that common domain project that I was telling you about that handles all the stuff behind the scenes. Well, it will actually call this function, and this is where I set the ID to the actual aggregate, set the product to active, and then set this product info based on all the information I got from the create product. And so that's what sets its private information on the aggregate. It is a little hard to explain and hard to understand. I know that. That's kind of why I want to get some questions going here in a few minutes. Just to show you how one of these things actually comes into play in the end. So when a product is actually created and it sends that event out, this class here will actually handle that product created message. And that's what this iMessage handler does. And then all I had to do is use my context for the database and just save it right in the database. And if anybody's used Entity Framework, you can see that's just all that is. That's just straight code first, actually. But that's what will actually save in the database, and now your website has full access to all that information. It could take anywhere between a second and days before this hits, depending on the type of processing that you want to do behind the scenes. Because anytime you're doing a lot of this, you can actually set up services that will actually long-running services. We call them sagas. And say, for instance, you're actually trying to import the whole vendor's catalog. There could be 50,000 products in that catalog. It could take a few hours for that to actually process. And so you want to use what they call a saga to do that. But one of the biggest things that I was wanting to get into here was you've got all this separation, and you keep all these things separate. This catalog should not know anything about a vendor, which is down here in logistics. And vice versa. That's the whole point of the separation of these contexts, so that you don't really stepping on anybody else's toes. One system can be down and all the other systems still operate. When that system comes up, it would actually start processing all the messages that it needs that was actually sent to it.
And so, if you think about the value prop here, really what we're seeing here is that I think Andrew really touched upon a very important point. that the catalog is still available, and so you can ensure uptime with your catalog. Your customers may or may not, depending on your business model, care about who the vendor is, right? In this case, they don't, because the company, they're trying to multi-source the vendors for the products and find the cheapest product, right? The cheapest option for that SKU. For the consumer, it's not as important because the retail price is still the same. So it'd be problematic if the warehouse or if the purchasing department or something were starting to do some major traffic and have some major activity and started lagging out the catalog system. The challenge is that when we start talking, if we start thinking about, in our traditional three-tier application, I would usually data model that as product, bridge table, vendor, right? And so that bridge table right there just destroyed the autonomy. It just destroyed the explicit boundary because now I've blended them both into one table. That's not quite much of a boundary if they both commingle there, right? So, and they're both dependent upon that table. So, what the CQS offers, what the ESB really offers us is it offers us a real clear understanding of right now we're trying to create a product. And then as Andrew was mentioning, we can support Saga, and if you guys remember from the NSB talk that we had last year, Sagas are long-running events. So if you have a vendor that says, I now sell this product, and you need to run over to catalog and add the product to the catalog, you can throw a message onto the bus, and then that add vendor product will just hang around waiting until there's an opportunity, until the product has been added. So.
And as you can see, this is just a basic Saga. You can see that it actually listens to multiple messages. I'm not going to go into detail about this at all, but as you see, it does handle a lot of different type of messages. And it actually, a Saga does have the ability to cross boundaries. For instance, down here in this product created, I actually listened to an event that was actually sent out from the catalog. And it's not listening to a command that the catalog boundary wants, it's listening to an event that it produced. So it's not really crossing the boundaries, but it's actually listening for stuff that's not actually part of its specific thing. And a lot of projects will actually separate these Sagas out to its own area because it's those things that actually cross the boundaries.
So that's a loose coupling opportunity there. So really, let's say that this fails, that didn't stop the product from being added to the catalog. We're not getting any exceptions being thrown on that domain, right? So, and then these domains can run on separate devices. So this is interesting for either a distributed or cloud implementation.
Correct.
So I'm guessing that your catalog service can run on its own database, which you can scale up or down.
Correct.
Exactly.
As you want. Then your logistics service.
Correct.
Different database, scale up or down as you want.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the flexibility.
One of the things in this project is we're actually not using a true database for each of these bounded contexts. It's actually more of an event store. These event stores can use a database, or can use flat file storage. You can use whatever type of storage system it wants. It just to help people, especially developers not understanding this whole concept yet, it's always good to start off in a database because that's what they understand.
Can you explain again why you're passing GUIDs, just the IDs and not the entire object?
Yes, because you do not want, because the larger these messages are, the harder they are to control. And you do not want one object to know about another object, especially within aggregate groups. An aggregate root is a specific set of stuff that you need to keep separate. I was just reading.
You would only pass the aggregate, and you're just trying to keep the bandwidth cost.
Yeah, well, it's not really just bandwidth, but it's actually keeping your separation of concerns. Let me open up one of these.
While he's opening that up, let's say, for example, I give you the product object. Now, as a developer, and maybe you're in the logistics domain. Now that I've given that to you, you will do with it as you please, right? If I have the data there, I'm going to use the data. So rather than offering you the data, we might offer you the ID and then talk about what else you might need. And so then you need to ask us specifically for that rather than just putting it there. That would help the boundaries be more explicit. If I'm giving you the entire product object, you may start to try to put business logic into the wrong domain. Mm-hmm.
So following up on the same question, you have just IDs of other objects, and for example, you have a list to display on the screen. And then you're coming up with the n+1 problem, which means that you have 10 objects on the screen, 10 rows. You have to have 11 queries to actually display the data on the screen. How do you solve it?
So, one query is possibly a list of GUIDs, a list of IDs. So that's certainly a valid query. I don't think it requires a round trip for each ID, right, Andrew?
No, it doesn't. As you can see right here, I'm actually pulling in a lot of stuff based on based on IDs from the actual message. So the message is just sending me in the order line and the order ID. So I have to go grab those.
Can I increase the font?
Yes. Sorry about that. This thing's hard to use.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I have a mouse. So do you need a mouse?
You can click down on the 83 and type a number.
Yeah. Oh, much better. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. And so as you see, I'll go grab the order in the order line from the repository. This is the event store. And then I just use this. I have a service class for order processing, and it just goes and processes the order, and it does a lot of things behind the scenes anyway. And then I can actually grab all the vendors, the selected vendors, which is pretty much a list of vendors that I actually can process this order. And then I just pick the best one. But that's what's coming into play when I'm actually just using ID, because this repository cannot do a query. It can only bring in by ID.
And so going back to our solution stack, are any tools needed to do SOA? Absolutely not, right?
No.
You could write a SOA compliant application following all the tenants and without using a single tool. The challenge is when we have more than one developer on a project. I have vision A, he has vision B, and between the two of them, we've just destroyed our entire application. So using these various tools, this is a great example right here of separation of concerns or autonomy and explicit boundaries, right? Where without these tools in place, there might have been the temptation to pass back an order vendor, right? That had an order with all the vendor information or vice versa, instead of passing in an order and then getting a list of valid vendors.
Yes.
So this might be a service bus question, but say you get the shopping cart service, and it submits an order, but the ordering service is down. So then the user submits another, and they submit another, and they submit another.
Well, the user wouldn't really know about that, because it like going to Amazon.
But it hasn't. The ordering service hasn't returned back the event saying that the order was created, right?
You see, okay, that's the nice thing about the way this happens is the actual client just sends the command. It just forgets about it. There's no response back.
Right, but so let's say the client does that, but then they go in and they don't see that the orders are
Okay.
latency.
Okay, there will be a latency, yes. If you go to Amazon, you'll see that latency there.
Right, but if you submit your orders from the shopping cart, I mean, you still have some sort of something that has been transferred from your shopping cart into either a pending order or all it goes through all the
Yeah,
stages of the order.
we can actually, what I would suggest is probably just creating because your database for that client is going to be probably in memory or just in the database. Go create a temp order for it.
Yeah, but now the shopping cart service knows about ordering.
No?
But I mean, if ordering is down, how is it going to create a temporary order?
So I think there's a difference though between cart and between order, right? And so I think what he's saying is perhaps you might say that there's a temporary cart, that there's a cart that's pending completion. And so I think it's fair for the cart to change status and say, okay, cart is in pending order. Now, how that might present to the users, it might say pending order, but technically it would be a pending cart.
So essentially the answer is each service needs to be responsible for transitioning the state away, and assuming that it's been handled, assuming that once that message has been sent, that it is going to be picked up on, even if they can't actually see the data that should be created.
Right.
It would be the responsibility of so typically there are stateful messages rather than commandful messages. So, for example, my cart is now complete, and then the let's say the finance and the logistics domain both would be interested in that, and they may want to charge the customer, and they may want to fulfill that. If either of them are unable to do that, they would then have the finance department or the logistics department would have a reasonable expectation in themselves to say, okay, we're not able to handle this. Customer service domain, please notify the customer, right? So there, and if you think about it a lot of times when I get into domain modeling, I go back to real world scenario, right? So I'm a salesperson, and I'm going to the customer. I'm like, okay, I got your order, great, good, thank you very much. I'm going over to logistics, and they're like, we're out of stock. Well, that's very, actually, I just dropped the order. To be real world, I dropped the order in the basket. Logistics comes over, picks up the order. We're out of stock on that. You call the customer and let them know, right? Or you might tell customer service to call the customer and let them know. So that's kind of the separation of concerns that we're looking at. And I think that customers are becoming, users are becoming more and more familiar with larger enterprise systems having that latency. That a lot of them think it's either a batch process, but quite often it's a message process.
Because the fear is that the customer doesn't see the order's been created, and they go, oh, my order hasn't been created. They go in and they submit another order.
Right.
Absolutely. So the way that Amazon actually satisfies that, and they do a great implementation and so on, is that if you've ever clicked one click twice in a row, so I had my one click fail, and then I went and clicked it again because I'm like, I wanted my one click. The one click service did not know that the order had failed. Right, so and so the one-click service is saying, you just try to place an order using one click. That's very, very similar to this one that you're placing now. So it knew about the one-click order that I just placed. It said, are you sure you'd like to do this? I said, yes, because I was told that it failed.
So it seems like, and this is the second question I have, which was the amount of overhead that SOA seems to involve. Because now you've got to have a whole bunch of rules to cover the latencies. Not only that, but you've got, it seems like a lot of overhead on the development costs of maintaining it.
Most definitely.
And using it and interacting with it.
Most definitely. It's actually, these type of systems are not for your just normal run-of-the-mill websites.
Yeah.
No, this is meant for large applications.
And the use case that this satisfies actually is for a pretty big auction website. So the throughput that we're trying to satisfy is people, either bots or humans, clicking on bid 250 times in a minute. And so we're trying to satisfy that.
So that's probably will answer my question, which is said. I've noticed that the immutable commands didn't use the properties; they just use read-only.
Correct. That's what I was trying. Yeah, that's what we get into independency, or however you say that word. But it's the ability. The whole fact is, no one can touch that object once it's created.
Right.
Nobody can modify it.
Right. Now, my question was actually really because when people implement that, they usually go for properties, so they will do public, integer, name of the property, gather, and private center. That way,
yes.
Now, this takes more memory than what you did, and that probably is because it's an auction website that has a large throughput.
I do this out of basic concept, of personal concept.
Okay.
I know me can disagree on this. He likes his public properties. I like my read-only fields.
Well, they take less space.
Well, they do take, it's a less memory imprint, but It's just a personal way of doing things.
Okay.
And I'd like to try to get my commands and events actually a little smaller so they don't have so much information in them. And that would actually expand on the actual process of what the business is doing, because then I'll have more commands doing smaller things.
And usually when I make decisions, I err on the side of maintainability over performance. An old mentor of mine, this is back in the old days of the 90s, he said, we had hard drive problems at the time where people were the powers that be were asking us to clean off hard drives, and he said, hard drive space is like toilet paper. Once you use it, do not clean it off. And and I'd like to think that RAM and CPU opportunities are also becoming like that toilet paper. Now, of course, we garbage collect, so we do clean off that toilet paper. But I'd like to think that that maintainability is paramount in today's world over a footprint. So,
I had a question about testability. I mean, obviously in this handler you have several lines there. How are you unit testing?
Okay, I have left out some stuff in here.
Oh, yeah. Go.
Yeah, this is actually in an area that I haven't done much work in. But usually, unit testing is actually based on the process, the business. So you want to actually design your unit tests using the given, when, then aspects.
Right.
So,
does everyone know what given, when, then is?
Okay. Given this set of variables or classes or events, when this command happens, these events should be processed. So it's more of a testability framework for message systems. It's very similar to MSpec.
So rather than your expected result, you just want to know what processes get triggered.
Yes. And so what we will normally do in classes right here is we'll actually do a
I'm not quite sure what it is.
I don't know what that
That's
means.
fancy.
Yeah. Right.
Right here. Error.
So we just do something like this. And what's nice about this is when we do stuff like this command will actually fail.
What is that order line?
It's assert not null.
Okay.
Here, let me move my mouse off that. It's just assert not null. Yeah. And all that does is if it's null, it'll throw an exception, this command will fail, and then in service bus will send it into the error queue for us to go fix it, whatever's wrong. And then we can just reprocess the command. Commands a lot of times will fail, but once you get past into the domain and processing the events, those should never fail.
And definitely, I think that what's interesting in this implementation is you start seeing us really talk about unit tests a lot more than integration tests. Because
Yes.
I don't know about you guys, but usually the moment I start to sit down and write a unit test, immediately becomes an integration test if I'm dealing with the persistence layer. And I'm like, oh, well, talk to this. Okay, done and done. I placed an order and I could check out.
Right.
So this really forces us, because there isn't really a persistence layer in a lot of times, for us to actually think about unit tests. And then we get to really red light on actual units rather than, well, somewhere in the whole place order checkout process we're red lighting.
Anyone else?
But I'll say with my experience with events and messages is that you can take an actual event that failed, right, and you can actually test that specific one. Right? You run it through your system and figure out why is that fail.
Well, really, an event the reason an event should never fail because it's actually populated after the domain has been changed based on the information, and it's just populating fields. There's nothing happening inside of
in
an
my case,
event.
there was other systems that were under my control that were
Well, now,
sending that.
Now, an event handler could fail.
Right, that's what I mean.
Okay, an event handler.
Process that message.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah,
So,
now that could happen.
Getting data I wasn't expecting.
Right.
In that message.
No, yes, that could definitely happen, especially in denormalizers when it's trying to look information up to populate the rest of the database. That could definitely happen.
And that goes back to semantic systems, where it's very interesting for us to be able to go back through the event log, the message log, and say, okay, you're telling me that you failed at this particular time. Let me find that message. Okay, I'm seeing that you tried to complete an order. And with that message, I think that's what you're saying, that you can really just run that through and see what happens, right?
One of these messages is failing, and it turns out, someone put a capital O instead of a 0 in there, and I was expecting an integer. So.
And a lot of times events will fail just because they've hit out of order.
Well, that's a different issue, yeah.
Yes.
It's something the system has to decide whether it's going to be ordered or not.
Well, it happens, especially within orders, because you go submit your order and you go update order lines later down the road. What if one of the order line updates got processed before the creation of the order?
And that's something that you have to make like you say, you have to make a decision on how latent dependent you are, how latent tolerant you are. A perfect example are these vendors. Let's say we have a product that we find out about. We have some purchasers are running around getting prices on these products from other vendors. Our business rule says pick the cheapest vendor. But then 2 seconds later, after we just ran that business logic, in comes a cheaper vendor. We don't run around trying to correct that. And that's a scenario that happens in a lot of systems.
So I'm curious in that case, if someone asks, well, why didn't you choose vendor X instead of vendor Y like you did? Do you does someone come back and say, you made the wrong choice? Or can you show that based on the data we had at that time, that was the right answer?
That's what these messages are pretty much for. And within this order processing class up here, I actually do a lot of those messages or commands. I send a lot of commands out to set these and why we set that specific vendor.
We also do persist. What we do is we start persisting a lot of, just in that case, which is kind of out of what we're talking about here. But what we do is we actually persist the business rule that actually won and why it won. So we save a lot of the state that we had within that method, so we can go back and justify it. And yeah, so.
What are the things that you are putting in your container in this application?
Not very many things. In Service Bus, of course. In Service Bus has a lot of internal stuff that it throws in the container. The event store has a few things. Let me open up well, the handler is all that's needing is the repository. So here in Service Bus is setting up all this stuff. So I'm using Windsor. I create my container, give it to in Service Bus to do all of its things, and then I just add four other components. Not very many at all.
So and how do you bind commands to command handlers and events to
in Service Bus does that for us.
Oh, it's Service Bus.
Yes.
But you have to register that in the Service Bus, right?
I'm sorry?
You have to register that.
Yes, that's what this first function up here is doing. This is configuring in Service Bus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there some XML configuring, or is it doing like a library scan?
It's Fluent API.
Okay. Scanning libraries.
Yeah, it uses reflection.
Top, like a message handler interface.
Yes, there's actually an iMessage handler with a generic, and there is. You've got pretty much just two of them.
So it reflects over the libraries to find classes that implement particular interfaces. And Udi has really great interface names such as I handle messages.
Yeah.
I want to run at startup.
Yes. Yeah. If you look at the top here, and I configured this endpoint. I want custom initialization. Udi's awesome. I love the way he thinks things.
So Actually, another technical question.
Sure.
I noticed that events are, again, immutable and serializable. So you can serialize them to the binary code.
Yes, I do all binary serialization.
Right. So if you, in the future, would like to take a look at the event log and see what the event is, you'd have to deserialize it back to
Oh,
the
yes.
message, right?
Yes.
You can also use XML serialization with a bigger footprint.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, you have to have a public constructor to do that.
Yeah, and the other concern, of course, is I mean, not that binary is all that secure, but having XML sitting in MSMQ, if you do have an exploit, it's much tastier than binary. So.
To go quickly over the structure of one of those modules or like logistics, the projects that you have there, what's the
Oh yeah.
Sure.
way things are divided?
And
Okay.
maybe talk to why we do that.
Okay. Come on. Pretty much within every context, we have 4-5 main projects. The catalog project or logistics project is a project that contains all the command handlers, the sagas, and event handlers if we need to process an event within here. The commands, the reason we separate out commands and events is so that other areas, especially the web areas, the public-facing areas, can actually reference just the commands or just the events, rather than having to reference the domain. That domain layer within all these projects, this class right here, nothing outside of this context should ever see anything within that project. That is a project that is built for internal use only. It's the whole separation of concerns there. It allows that's a separate process.
The commands are really your kind of public API for
Yes. If the project actually loaded, I don't know why it didn't. Let me try reloading it. Because I was wanting to show you all that. And IIS, yeah. But what it does, that is just a WCF service. And all it does is do all the calls to create commands. There's no reading from that WCF service at all. All you can do is send stuff to it. It's like the whole point of having a separate read side rather than the separate write side.
And CQS was something that we implemented a little bit later. Andrew actually made that decision. Andrew, can you speak to a little bit of your decision-making process in rolling CQS into the stack?
Well, that's hard to explain. When I first started working on this project, I heard the initial idea of CQRS, which is Command Query Responsibility Separation. Thank you. I started reading a lot about it, and I started getting very interested. And I seen that we was doing something similar when I first joined, but it wasn't truly separated. We had one service that done both. They did have separation of concerns. They had catalog separated, logistics separated, and all that good stuff. But we still had read and write within the same area, and it was getting all convoluted. And I thought it was a little just too much in one area. So I started doing a lot more research, and it took me quite a bit of research to get to where this project's at now. But I see this as a much more enriched application than what it was.
If you think about, the ESB scenario, there are some times where I have no response for you if you issue me a command, right? Other than thank you. So there becomes this inconsistent pattern. Sometimes I get a response, sometimes I don't. If it's in the same domain, I might get a response right back from you. So rather than having this inconsistent call like, oh that's right, this method I have to go out and now query to get the data back. This one, this allows a nice consistent pattern across the board.
Sure. I heard you kind of mention a response there. So it's not uncommon for you to send a command and then you might have an event immediately generated afterwards.
No, it's a command query responsibility separation. So you're separating the responsibility of each area. That's what that's getting into. So it's not really a response back, it's a responsibility of what that specific thing's doing.
And if we go back to the real world scenario again, let's say, for example, you tell me I would like one widget. I'm not going to then say to you, okay, I hear you say you would like one widget. I'll be like, okay, thank you, and go get you one widget, right? So it's redundant for us to hand it back to you quite often after you've given us a command. Certainly, there's mutability that happens after the command, but that should not be your concern. That's my concern, to make sure that I take care of that for you. So it really ensures that we're separating concerns at that point, because then you're not trying to do some fancy footwork with the order after I kick it back to you. I'm forced to take care of the whole order fully and completely.
And there are certain scenarios where you will want to, because the way I have this set up is my service layer right here, this service project. Every call within it has its own specific command, and if one of these commands are failed to create, WCF can actually tell the client something failed. But once that command has been created and sent, the client will have no clue what's going on.
And I think that's a perfect example of data validation. For example, a lot of times we'll put, we'll put validators. We'll use data annotations or something to indicate various validation on what you're sending, the messages you're providing to us, to prevent dirty data in messages. So.
And that's where that validation would occur, is right there in that service right here. So we validate all these commands before they even reach the bus, especially for string length, making sure this price is within this range, and all that good stuff.
Could you talk a little bit more about sagas, how they work, and how you have this implemented?
Okay, Saga is pretty much what you'd use in a long-running process, like I was saying earlier. They can have timeouts so that, let's say, you process it in the catalog, and if it takes over an hour, you want it to shut down and not do anything else. So what you can actually what you do is you set up this timeout manager, which is actually built into in-service bus now. They have a really nice timeout manager built in for you, so you can attach to it, and once the time is reached, it will actually send you a command that you listened for, and you shut down the Saga. Let me open up this. Okay, so when this Saga is first created, there's this interface up here, as you see. It's called I started by message. So when I receive this process catalog message, it's telling me to start the Saga.
And can you give us just a little viewpoint on the use case here?
Okay. The whole point of this is that we've got vendors that have very large sets of products, and we need to be able to process these on a weekly, daily basis. And so what we do is we start at the Saga, and it will actually go grab the catalog, download it, convert it to XML, and then it will start processing all the product catalogs. And that's where this product created, this process catalog. That's what starts this whole thing. And so what I do here is I go in here and I tell it to do this update catalog for this specific vendor. This vendor I use IOC to inject all my vendors when this whole service is started up, so that I can just grab whichever vendor this process catalog message is telling me to do. And then I tell it to do this update catalog. This update catalog is based on, every vendor has one. All it does is get up there. Mm-hmm. It just makes all this interface, and the vendor actually just inherit from this interface and do all of its work. Because every vendor will have different XML files and different settings, different all kinds of things. So all this pretty much is doing is just going through all of this. And that first thing, the update catalog sends out a bunch of create product messages or commands. And then here is I listen for the product created. And I check to see how many has been added, and once it's actually added to the full product count, and then I go do an update inventory, which the update inventory will update the number, the quantity of items they've got, the actual price that they sell it for, and other information specific for this one vendor. And then once that's done, then we've got.
So during the updates, you're actually putting messages in the bus and receiving them back.
Yes,
The message back.
here, let me open up one of those vendors.
You're handling those product creative messages while the saga initiating.
Now, while it's initiating, the product, the process catalog actually does that. Here, let me get back into it.
But you're still in process catalog while those are coming up. And
No, actually, no.
okay.
I'll show you that here in a second. Oh, wait a minute, I might be. Now that I think about it. Oh, no, because the way this happens is in this product, this update catalog, I send this command, as you see down here. Here, let me make this a little bigger. Right here, it goes through all the products, and it sends this command to the bus, which is purely asynchronous. So it does not know about the processing the catalog is doing. And so this is just going to send all these commands, 50,000 of them, however many there are, and it'll start processing those. And then once it's done sending them all, then that function over in Saga is complete.
How do you handle transactions?
In-service bus takes care of all that for us.
So if you have to roll something back, like in the middle of the saga.
Now, sagas can be broken in the middle. What you do is you actually use that same type of, because it's actually the command that's going to be broken. And so when that command is broken, it'll actually go into the error queue, and then the service bus can reprocess it.
And if you had a critical failure, each domain will be responsible for updating status, or updating its persistence accordingly. So let's say, for example, you have an order and you run out and you acquire payment on that. And somewhere in the logistics chain, you have a problem, and you need to. You would then need to issue a refund to that customer, right? We're not going to try to roll back that transaction. You can't even, because you're crossing a domain into the bank world. So we can't. So just think about it just like if you had a problem after you process payment, right? So what you would do is you go back to the credit card company and issue a refund. Same scenario in all these messages. You'd have to run around and correct things rather than trying to roll back your transaction if it's cross-domain.
So like if you're importing a catalog where you wanted to make sure that the entire catalog went live simultaneously, right? So that, let's say it's a Christmas catalog.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to go live at midnight on December 1st or on Black Friday or whatever the case is.
That would probably be a matter of actually maintaining the status of the product. So you probably have a published, unpublished status, right? So that would probably be a business rule, less an actual message handling rule.
So the way you would handle such messages, such corrections, you would actually set another message saying correct this issue.
Rather than saying correct this issue, you might say this fulfillment failed. Anyone who would be interested in knowing the order number failed, or fulfillment ID failed, they would then take action accordingly.
And we're actually in the process of creating an editor for all these messages that go into the error queue that will actually open up the message and allow you to edit the properties on these messages and then be able to resend it back to the queue.
So just a quick question: How are the handlers subscribing to these messages?
In-service bus does that.
But is it just like you said, fulfillment failed? Is that a string representation? Is that a type that represents that, an enumerator? I mean, how do the...
Tell me if I'm answering your question, but can you pull up a handler?
Yeah.
So here we have a message handler that handles create vendor.
That's not right.
So that would be interesting. Let's see here. So we could also have one that would say that vendor created, right? So that would be a message.
That would be the event,
So-
vendor created.
Okay, and then you can handle that event, right? So it would
Exactly.
be vendor created.
Great. So that is, where does that type live? Is that some common shared data type across all the services? Because each service might be interested in that type, knowing how to create an event, like maybe the billing when it's in my head, I've got a new person to insert into their system.
Right. That's where they would actually create a handler.
Okay.
They would create their own handler to listen for that event, and then it would be able to grab all the information off of that
Can you
event.
go to the definition of discrete event?
Yeah.
So you add a reference from the event.
Yes, you would. That's why the events commands are separate assemblies, so they can be referenced from outside. That's the whole reason of the separation, multiple DLLs.
So that's just like this library that is kind of be used by all the services.
One of the approaches is definitely to put all of your messages or events into one library. We've spread them out. Mixed feelings about that. So what we do is we actually put them into each domain. So each domain has its own messages or events.
So the whole point, for the reason why I did it was, especially on some of your front-facing, your clients, they don't need to listen to all these events. They don't need to know about everything from every single context.
Right, so you don't make the type available.
Right. So like right here in this app config, right here, I'm actually telling it which events and which messages to actually listen to from which domains.
And you can also lock down the security a little bit on that. So, and I can't remember the exact syntax, but there's a way to say, I will only let so-and-so listen to me, and then in-service bus will enforce it accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
So then, just trying to think again. So it's still this lightweight DLL, this lightweight library that is shared across all the services and referenced accordingly, essentially.
Yeah, and so you could...
That's one way. Right. You're putting messages. If you put XML messages, then they don't necessarily need the library.
You still need the library.
You just have to parse the library, the message in a way, and they're just sharing the DLL so that you can share you can parse the message without having to bother, and rewrite.
The library is still necessary because even in the XML scenario, that's just serialized
Right,
types.
it's the content of the message.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the payload.
Right.
The other thing is the actual, like, this kind of message, regardless of what my payload is.
Right.
So that, now, do the clients share that same service side, the same type library that all the services share as well?
And what do you mean?
When you say client, are you
well,
talking...
when you mentioned clients where you can actually restrict, you're registering what,
Gotcha.
what you're saying that the clients can only listen to those two types of, when you went and pointed on the board there.
Well, what I do here is...
We haven't played a lot with the actual lockdown or the permissioning around what you could subscribe to or what you could not.
Okay.
But there is a way to do that.
Okay.
We're not that secure. It's just not that important yet because really within our environment we know it's all within at least one organization. Now if we're in multiple, if we were inter-organizational, that might be more interesting.
The key is that the clients here, not like the guy from the other side of the internet.
Right.
The clients are all on the same bus.
Warehouse and customer service, both friends.
Internal service.
Yeah.
Well, now, what I'm looking at for the client here is like this control panel publisher here. This control panel publisher is an in-service bus service, so it listens to all these events. But this control panel here is actual the website, and all this publisher does is put stuff into this data area. That's all it does. So this what I'm looking at client is the actual what I mean by denormalizer, which actually reads all these events, it translates them so that the actual website can interpret the data. Because that whole database for that control panel would be based on the views it needs. And so you're just trying to populate those data models.
And sorry, I'll just keep going on. In that handler, that type that create vendor, I think we also go to the definition. What is in that? Is it just an empty class?
Yeah, can you pop into the definition?
Right,
Yeah.
That's fine.
Just F12.
I'm not used to F12.
So I'm a command.
Okay.
This is from in-service bus.
Yes.
And then the state or the message, the contents of the message, and that's it. So, I mean, that's just passed around from friend to friend. So it is essentially the message. Yep. And then once you get that type coming out off the bus, then in-service bus would be responsible for spinning up and passing that on to the appropriate class. Yeah.
I'm not that familiar with in-service bus, so what would happen if you would set a command that doesn't have a listener? So
you'll get an error.
Okay. But the system keeps running, it just get an error which just gets even log, the error log.
So you would actually get a critical response back from bus.send, is that correct?
Yeah.
Bus.send. So you say bus.send, and it'll say no. Most of the time, though, as long as there's something to grab onto it and the message is well formed, it's going to just accept it. And then it would be the responsibility of someone else to handle any problems or exceptions. If there's a critical failure, we'll actually throw an exception, bubble an exception up to you saying, we weren't even able to put this on the bus. And because there wasn't a subscriber in our ecosystem. And you can get incredibly complex in the ecosystem or incredibly simple. You can do a single subscriber and a single publisher, and you could have, buy and sell, and that's it, right? But you can also get to a very multi-node scenario, and that's something that I don't know about. There's some really great videos on inservicebus.org. There's 2 of them actually that Udi talks about a lot of this stuff and the details around in-service bus. If you're interested in getting into the nitty-gritty. They're very entertaining and very interesting.
1 year ago from Lee's presentation is out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
So I'm curious, this is obviously a different way of programming than most developers are used to, right? This is not synchronous calls and methods.
Right.
So how is the uptake of this way of working for your developers?
Well, from what this comes from a presentation that Greg Young, I think, that I showed you. One of the things he actually says, you keep a lot of your higher level developers within the domain area. Don't let junior developers inside of there. Send them all to the denormalizers, the data models in the clients. That's where they work.
So you're sort of going to have tiers of
Yes,
developers.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Also, your junior developers can play in the space of defect resolution inside a domain. Once it's been constructed, they'll be able to understand it pretty clearly. I think that the initial construction of it is fairly complex. But as you can see as well, when you're writing it, really there isn't a lot of code there. It's a lot of thought. And so, it's pretty tight, terse code. So, it's mostly around some integration work and things like that the juniors might be able to help with and things like that when they get into. But these tool sets, the nice thing about it is what we found is that because we've established these tool sets and because we've established this architecture, we can unleash a junior developer into this environment, and they're not even able to cross domains anymore because the data just isn't there. They'd have to work very, very hard to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I do not ever underestimate the dedication of the copy-paste power and everything else. But I would hope that, I think that there's the opportunity for them to find an easier, softer way to the answer. So I know that we're starting to run out of time, right, Serge? I want to...
No, you have stuff to talk.
We don't have anything to talk about, but we're happy to continue to answer questions or have any other discussion.
So your experience here has been mostly working, you guys all working in the entire application, right? Like, any experiences working with other teams, sending messages in the bus and how to... Okay.
We will see soon. But some use cases on the horizon.
I have loved the fact that I have actually just run the website, started adding stuff, not realizing I wasn't running any of these services. I go start up the services immediately. It processes every single thing I just sent.
Right, but what happens when not that you can't receive the messages, but just the messages being received are of other types, or and that would be mostly about how to keep communication with other people and sharing of libraries and.
So I think that outside of your, so in intra-company, I think sharing libraries is interesting. With tight business partners, sharing libraries is interesting. For a larger ecosystem, that's where you have your WCF area, your WCF separator, right? And so, but because you have these underpinning domains, you really you're able to separate those concerns as well. One of the concerns that I've had. And we haven't been in production long enough to know is one of my concerns is these libraries keeping the version controlling them, right? Yep. If they're distributed across, but there are tools that are available for that, and our NetOps guys would know a little bit more about that. But the replication tools to keep all those things in sync, because I don't care to copy the same DLL to 10 servers.
One of the big things that I've read and haven't implemented yet was just versioning your actual commands. Mm-hmm. Instead of worrying about editing an old command that's been there forever, create a new one, just name it different or put a V1 on the end of it or something.
And then the problem of having to process the commands that still exist while.
Well, see, that's why you have both.
Right.
So you wouldn't have to worry about it.
And that is something that we've seen for a while now, and even old school ASMX is where you see a lot of times where people in a new version of a product will just add a new method called like create product EX.
Yeah.
Create product EX2 to prevent to preserve backwards compatibility.
Deprecates previous ones and just
and that preserves backwards compatibility.
Just on that versioning, assumptions that you could extend your existing command.
Yes, you can.
Extend it, and then obviously that's the actual type that new listeners would listen to.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I've thought about this quite a bit, especially here lately now that we're getting closer and closer, and I'm afraid a lot of this is going to change after they're going.
I mean, it is a similar deprecation model to any other.
The problem is keeping control of that because you have all these models, all these commands. It's quite easy for somebody to just go and change something, right? Understanding what's being changed.
But the nice thing I've noticed about binary serialization is I've actually changed classes and have been deserialized just fine.
As long as you're careful, but
yeah, as long as you're careful.
How to pass all the messages and things exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's also where you're, so in addition to some unit tests, you may want some integration tests that would red light on some of that.
Here there are people who use products other than .NET to develop software. Are there any tools that will help you do this when you're dealing with the domains that are different?
I'll defer to the other folks in here.
I know there's a lot of stuff out there, especially for Java. There's a ton of stuff. Actually, if you read anything about from Udi, Greg Young, you will find that a lot of their stuff is actually originally built in Java, and they've now written in .NET. So look at especially them two names, and you'll find out a lot of stuff about this.
I'm also trying to remember the name of the. Anyone remember the ESB that's homogeneous? There is a homogeneous ESB out there that likes both Java and .NET, and I can't remember what it's called. Yes, that's it.
RabbitMQ, yes.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you're doing integration in the queuing system. So
yeah.
Yeah, and you can even put RabbitMQ underneath the ESB or NSB then in service bus layer if you so desired. Although that would seem strange.
Do you guys look into other middleware kind of tools that Microsoft or anyone else has?
Yes, we looked at BizTalk.
Yeah.
We turned on notice about it.
Yeah.
In a heartbeat.
Here is why. And actually, there was a moment where our client thought they actually wanted us to parse X12 as well. And if anyone knows X12, yes. And BizTalk allegedly parses X12, and we actually found an open source library to parse X12 to avoid BizTalk. So I don't have any personal experience with BizTalk, but our client did, and he hated it, and that was the end of that discussion. So, there's BizTalk, but he's like, no. So, ESB or NSB is interesting, and like I say, I feel like it's like the middle path between BizTalk and the Wild Wild West, because it is built on top of MSMQ. So at least you can go to Microsoft and say, MSMQ is broken. Please fix.
Right, thank you.